She's not the one we sent for." Daniel Holt said it loud enough for the entire platform to hear. Clara Finch stood motionless beside her trunk, 3 days on a train, a signed contract in her bag, and a man looking straight through her like she was someone else's error. The crowd watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Clara did not step back. She did not look away. She looked at him directly and said, "We have a contract, Mr. Holt, and I intend to honor it whether you do or not." The platform went silent. For the first time in her life, the wrong woman in the wrong place said exactly the right thing. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey to the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The contract had been signed 6 weeks before Clara Finch ever set foot in Texas. Daniel Holt had written to the Westfield Matrimonial Agency in Kansas City with a list of requirements so precise they bordered on inventory. He needed a woman between 20 and 30 years of age, in good health, capable of domestic work, pleasant in disposition, and this was the word he'd underlined, twice presentable. He was a man of standing in Dusty Creek. He ran 400 acres of cattle land. He had a reputation to uphold, a house to fill, and neighbors who watched everything he did and talked about most of it by Sunday morning. What Daniel Holt had not expected was Clara. The agency had matched them on paper. Clara Finch, 26, from a farming family outside of Wichita. Literate, capable, experienced in the management of household and land. The agency wrote that she was steady, reliable, and possessed of a quiet intelligence that would serve a working ranch well. There was no mention of beauty. There was no mention of charm. There were only the facts of who she was, written cleanly on a single page, and Daniel Holt had signed his name to them without reading carefully enough. Clara had read his letter 7 times. She had folded it back into its envelope each time and set it in the top drawer of the nightstand, in the room she shared with her younger sister Ruth. She had read it the way a woman reads something she is trying to convince herself to believe, hunting for warmth between the formal lines, looking for the man behind the careful words. She hadn't found much, but she had found enough. She was tired of Wichita. She was tired of the farm that was slowly failing the debts her father refused to acknowledge, the certainty that if she stayed another 5 years, she would become invisible so completely that no one would notice she was gone. Ruth was pretty, and Ruth was charming, and Ruth would find a husband the way beautiful women do, without contracts, without agencies, without negotiating the terms of her own worth on paper. Clara had long understood that she would have to build a different kind of life, using a different set of tools. She had packed carefully. She had brought practical things. She had written Daniel Holt 1 letter in return, a single page, honest and unadorned, and received no response. She had decided that meant nothing either way, because the contract was signed and the ticket was purchased, and there was nothing left to do but go. The train from Kansas City to Dusty Creek took 3 days, and one missed connection in a town so small it didn't appear on the map she carried. She had eaten very little and slept in short fragments, sitting upright watching the landscape outside the window change from flat farmland to something drier and wider and more indifferent. Texas was not trying to welcome anyone. She respected that. She stepped onto the platform at Dusty Creek at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. Not because of anything she could name at first. It was a feeling the way the air around a group of people shifts when they are all looking at the same thing, and none of them are saying what they're thinking. There were perhaps 30 people on that platform. Some were meeting family. Some were collecting freight. But a cluster near the far end of the platform had arranged themselves the way people arrange themselves when they are watching a performance, loose semicircle faces, forward waiting. Daniel Holt was at the center of it. She recognized him from the single photograph the agency had provided. 41 years old, square-jawed, dark-haired, going to gray at the temples. A tall man with a rancher's posture and hands that looked like they had done real work at some point, even if they didn't much anymore. He was standing with 2 men she didn't know, and a woman who was almost certainly his sister, because the resemblance was sharp, and the proprietary expression was the same. They were all looking at her. None of them were smiling. Clara walked toward him with her trunk being carried behind her by the porter she had tipped with her last remaining coins. She kept her pace steady. She had learned years before that the worst thing a woman in her position could do was let the uncertainty show on her face. Whatever happened next was going to happen. She might as well walk into it upright. She was 10 feet away when Daniel Holt said it. "She's not the one we sent for." He said it to his sister. He didn't bother to lower his voice. The words landed on the platform like something dropped from a height, and Clara felt every person within earshot absorb them, and she watched the ripple move through the crowd, the way she had watched stones dropped into still water when she was a child, outward touching everything. She stopped walking. She looked at him directly. "Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice was level. She had made it level through will alone, and she was not going to let that effort show either. "I'm Clara Finch. We have a contract." "I know who you are," he said, which was worse somehow than if he hadn't. He looked her over in the way men sometimes look at livestock. They are considering not purchasing, a frank assessing gaze that moved from her face to her frame and back again, and found something insufficient. "The agency sent the wrong woman." "The agency sent the woman whose name you signed a contract with," Clara said. His sister made a small sound that was almost a laugh and was also contempt. She was beautiful in the careful way of women who have been told their whole lives that beauty is their most important attribute and have arranged everything around protecting it. Her name, Clara would later learn, was Margaret. At that moment, she was simply the woman standing beside Daniel Holt, who was looking at Clara the way a person looks at something they stepped in. "You're not what was described," Daniel said. "I am exactly what was described. The agency provided an accurate account of my qualifications. If you expected something different, the error is in your expectations, Mr. Holt, not in the contract." That silenced him for 3 full seconds. Around them, the platform crowd had gone almost entirely still. The man collecting freight had stopped pretending to check his manifest. The woman meeting her son from the train was watching with her mouth slightly open. This was not the scene they had expected to witness. A mail-order bride arriving in Dusty Creek was common enough gossip. A mail-order bride who talked back on the platform before she'd even shaken hands, that was something different. "Margaret," Daniel said to his sister without looking away from Clara. "Take her to the Granville house. She can stay there tonight." He looked past Clara, then the way men look past people they have already dismissed. "I'll need to contact the agency." Clara did not move. "You will need to honor the contract," she said, "or you will need to explain in writing to the Westfield Matrimonial Agency why you are in breach of it. Either way, I am not your problem to store at the Granville house. I am a woman who traveled 3 days on your written agreement. You will speak to me directly, or we will find a magistrate who can explain the terms of a legally binding document to you." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Daniel Holt turned back to look at her. Something had shifted in his face. Not warmth, not respect exactly, but the particular attention a man gives to something that has surprised him when he was absolutely certain he would not be surprised. Margaret stepped forward. "Who do you think you are speaking to my brother like?" "I think I'm Clara Finch," Clara said, "whose name is on a contract that your brother signed, and I think this conversation would be better conducted somewhere that isn't a train platform with half the town standing witness to it, but that's your brother's decision to make, not mine." She waited. The crowd waited. Even Daniel Holt seemed to understand in that moment that the next thing he said was going to be remembered. He said, "Fine. Come to the ranch." Adieu. The Holt Ranch was everything Clara had tried not to imagine on the train. She had told herself not to picture it, not to build it up into something she would be devastated to find different. And she had mostly failed, the way people always fail when they tell themselves not to think about something. It was large, undeniably large. 400 acres worked out to something that took a full 10 minutes to cross by wagon, and the house at the center of it was the kind of house a man builds when he wants everyone within 20 miles to know he has done well for himself. 2 stories wide porch wood-framed windows that probably cost 3 times what the functional version would have. But there was something wrong with it that Clara noticed almost immediately and couldn't immediately name. It was a house that wasn't being maintained properly, not catastrophically, not obviously to someone who wasn't looking. But Clara had spent her entire adult life keeping her father's farm from sliding backward. And she had developed a specific kind of seeing for the signs of deferred work. The fence post that had been leaning too long, the garden that had gone from productive to merely ornamental, the porch boards that creaked in a particular way that said they'd been wet and dried unevenly and would need replacing inside a year. She walked up those porch steps behind Margaret and felt the boards shift under her weight and thought, no one has looked at this house in months. Maybe longer. Margaret led her inside with the tight-shouldered silence of a woman who was furious and had decided to express it through very precise hospitality. She showed Clara the bedroom she could use, pointed out the kitchen and the pump, and left without a word that wasn't strictly informational. Clara set her trunk at the foot of the bed and sat down beside it. The room was clean. The room was cold, in the way of rooms that are cleaned for guests who are not warmly expected. There was a pitcher of water on the washstand, and a lamp with enough oil in it to last the evening, and beyond that, no evidence that anyone had thought about what she might need or want. She was not going to cry. She had not cried on the platform, and she was not going to cry now in a stranger's clean, cold bedroom, because she had made a decision to come here, and she was going to find out what the truth of it was before she decided what to do next. That was how she had always operated. Facts first. Grief later, if grief was warranted. She washed her face. She changed out of the traveling dress. She pinned her hair. She went downstairs. Daniel Holt was in what passed for a study. A room with a desk buried under papers. 2 mismatched chairs, and the particular atmosphere of organized chaos that belongs to a man who has been managing something alone for too long. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and he did not look pleased that she had come downstairs rather than staying in the room where he had put her. "I think we should talk," Clara said. "I think I have nothing to say tonight." "Then you can listen," Clara said, and sat down in one of the mismatched chairs without being invited to. He stared at her. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. After a moment that cost him something, he sat back in his chair. "What do you want to say?" "I want to know what you actually need," Clara said. "Not what you told the agency. Not what you thought you were getting. What you actually need on this ranch right now. Because I can see from the porch boards and the kitchen garden and the way your ledger stack has been falling left for at least 2 months that things are not operating the way they should be here. And I am not asking out of nosiness. I am asking because I came here to work Mr. Holt. That is what I agreed to. If you want to dissolve the contract, I will discuss the terms of that dissolution with you honestly. But before you decide, I think you should know what I am actually capable of." He didn't say anything for long enough that the silence started to have weight. "You saw all that," he finally said from the porch. "And the kitchen. Your flour bin hasn't been properly restocked in at least a week, which means whoever is managing your household supply is either overwhelmed or not paying attention. And the garden has been left to bolt, which means you've been losing produce you don't need to lose." She paused. "Who runs this house, Mr. Holt?" "No one," he said, "at the moment." "What happened?" Another pause, longer this time. He looked at the desk rather than at her. "My housekeeper left in the spring. My foreman's wife was helping for a time, but she has children to manage and couldn't maintain it. And I have been—" He stopped, started again. "I have been occupied with other matters." "What other matters?" He looked at her then, and there was something in that look, not openness, not trust, nothing so warm or voluntary as that, but a kind of assessment. The same look he had given her on the platform, but working in a different direction. Not measuring what she lacked, measuring what she might be. "That," he said carefully, "is not your concern yet." "Yet," Clara said. "Don't read things into words, Miss Finch." "I read what's there," she said. "You said yet. That's a word with a time attached to it, which means you haven't entirely decided that you're sending me back. He said nothing, which was in its way an answer. She learned the shape of the problem in fragments over the following 2 days, the way you learn the dimensions of a room in the dark, by moving carefully and noting what you find with your hands. The cattle operation itself was functioning. That much was clear. The men who worked the range were competent and had apparently worked for Daniel Holt long enough to operate with minimal supervision on the day-to-day. What was failing was everything that surrounded the cattle, the administrative machinery, the household, the financial tracking that connected one quarter of the year to the next. There were 3 months of receipts that hadn't been properly logged. There were vendor relationships that had gone cold because nobody had followed up on the correspondence. There were debts, not disastrous ones, but the kind that become disastrous if you look away from them long enough, that were sitting at the edge of the desk pile close to, do not yet in default, but threatening it. Clara had spent 11 years managing her father's failing farm. She had kept that farm alive for 7 of those years through a combination of meticulous accounting, creative negotiation with creditors, and the ability to do the work of 3 people while receiving no credit for any of it. She recognized what was in front of her. She recognized it the way you recognize an accent instantly, without having to think about it. On the morning of the 3rd day, she sat down at the desk in the study. Daniel was out with the cattle and began going through the papers. Margaret found her there 2 hours later. "What do you think you're doing?" Clara set down the receipt she was annotating. "Organizing. Those are private documents. Mr. Holt left me unsupervised in a room containing them," Clara said, which was technically true and deliberately incomplete, since Daniel Holt had not left her here intentionally, so much as he had simply not told her what she was and wasn't allowed to do. "If he wants to tell me to stop, he can tell me himself." Margaret stepped further into the room. She was trying to look imperious, and she was mostly succeeding. But there was something underneath it, a thread of something else. Worry, Clara thought. Not about the papers, about something else. "You're going to embarrass him," Margaret said. "In front of the town. Already people are talking. He sent for a bride and got this." She gestured at Clara with a movement that encompassed everything Clara was and found it wanting. "He should have sent you back immediately." "Why didn't he?" Clara asked. The question landed exactly as she intended it to. Margaret's composure flickered. "I don't know what you mean." "He had 3 days to contact the agency and declare breach," Clara said. "He hasn't. That's a decision. I'm curious why he made it." "He doesn't know what to do with you," Margaret said, and it came out more honestly than she'd intended because she immediately closed her mouth after and looked away. Clara picked up her receipt annotation and continued writing. "Most people don't," she said. "They figure it out eventually." She found the first problem by accident on the 4th day, and it was not a small problem. She had been cross-referencing the ledger entries against the vendor receipts, a mechanical task that required nothing but patience and attention, and she had been finding the expected small discrepancies. A column carried wrong. A price written incorrectly, the sort of arithmetic error that happens when a tired man manages his own books without help. What she found in those March entries was not an arithmetic error. It was a payment. A significant payment, $340, made out to a company called Territorial Land Services for assessment and survey fees. Clara wrote down the amount and the date and turned back through the ledger, looking for any corresponding entry in the accounts receivable, any notation about what land had been assessed or why the fee had been necessary. There was nothing. She looked for a contract with Territorial Land Services. Nothing. She looked for any correspondence with this company. Nothing. She looked for any mention of it anywhere in the paper record of the Holt Ranch operations going back 18 months, and found the payment in March and nothing else. $340 paid to a company that left no paper trail in return. She set her pen down and looked at the wall. Then she went looking for Daniel Holt. She found him at the eastern fence line talking with his foreman, a quiet, sun-weathered man named Cal, who had acknowledged Clara's arrival with a nod and a complete absence of opinion, which she had decided to interpret as neutral goodwill. She waited until Cal had moved off down the fence line before she spoke. "Territorial Land Services," she said without preamble. "March 15th, $340. Daniel went still in a way that told her everything before he said a word. "Where did you find that?" he asked. His voice was careful, too careful. "In the ledger, with no corresponding documentation, no contract, no correspondence, no survey results." She paused. "Mr. Holt, what is Territorial Land Services?" He looked at her for a long moment. The Texas sun was flat and direct above them, and there was no shade on that fence line, and they were both standing in it, and he looked like a man deciding whether he trusted someone he had not expected to have any reason to trust. "It's complicated," he said. "I understand complicated," Clara said. "I have been managing complicated since I was 15 years old. Please tell me what that payment was for." It came out in pieces over the next hour standing on that fence line, and none of it was good. There was a land dispute. That was the beginning of it. 40 acres on the southern boundary of the Holt Ranch that had been Holt land for nearly 20 years, clearly described in Daniel's deed, clearly established in the county records. 6 months ago, a man named Rance Whitmore had arrived in Dusty Creek with a competing claim, a deed supposedly older than Daniel's, supposedly establishing the same 40 acres as belonging to a property Whitmore was in the process of purchasing from the estate of a man who had died in Kansas. Whitmore was not a rancher. He was a land agent, the particular kind of land agent who appeared in growing territories with a lawyer and a stack of paperwork and a talent for finding property that could be claimed disputed and eventually settled in his favor through attrition, if not through legal right. He had done this in 3 other counties. He had won twice. Territorial Land Services was one of his companies. The $340 had not been a survey fee. It had been something worse, a payment that Daniel had made on the advice of a man he now realized had been working for Whitmore, under the impression that it would resolve the dispute quietly. Instead, it had created a paper record, suggesting that Daniel had acknowledged the legitimacy of the competing claim. "You paid a company controlled by the man trying to take your land," Clara said slowly, making sure she had it correctly. "I didn't know it was his company," Daniel said. "I was told it was an independent assessor." "Who told you that?" A pause. "A lawyer named Garrett. He came recommended by the county clerk." "Is the county clerk friendly with Whitmore?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I'm beginning to think so." Clara looked out at the fence line. 40 acres, she was calculating. At this location, at current land prices in this county, probably, what's the land worth? "It's not about the money," he said, and then correcting himself. "It's not only about the money, it's river access. The 40 acres runs along the eastern tributary. Without it, I lose water rights for the southern pasture. I'd have to reduce the herd by a third. A third of a 400-acre cattle operation. She understood now why the ledger was falling apart. He had been managing this crisis with everything he had, and everything else had suffered. "Does Whitmore know about the payment?" she asked. "His lawyer mentioned it at the last meeting. Mentioned it as if it was settled, as if the fact that I'd paid meant I'd agreed." "Did you sign anything when you made the payment?" "A receipt." "Do you have it?" He reached into his coat pocket automatically, as if he'd been carrying it, and handed her a folded paper. She opened it. She read it. She read it again. It was bad. But it was not as bad as she had feared. "This isn't an acknowledgement of the claim," she said. "It's written as a payment for assessment services. Not an agreement. Not a concession." She looked up at him. "Who has seen this?" "Whitmore's lawyer. Me. Now you." She folded it carefully and held it. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I need to go to the county record office." He stared at her. "Why?" "Because if Whitmore has manufactured a competing deed, there will be errors in it. There are always errors. A document that is actually 40 years old has a paper trail clerk's notations, tax records, transfer histories. A document that was manufactured last year has gaps." She held up the receipt. "And because this payment, if it's properly understood, may actually help your case, not hurt it. It documents that you were defrauded by a company that is now claiming to have assessed disputed land, which means Whitmore's agent was on your property, representing themselves as neutral while working against you. That is not an acknowledgement. That is evidence of fraud." The fence line was very quiet. The Texas sun moved 3 degrees while Daniel Holt looked at Clara Finch. "You know law," he finally said. "I know records," she said. "My father lost land to a boundary dispute when I was 19. I spent 4 months in the Wichita County Record Office afterward, learning everything I could because I was determined it would never happen to us again." She paused. "It did happen again because my father kept making the same decisions. But I know what to look for." Daniel was looking at her in a way he had not looked at her before. Not the dismissive assessment from the platform. Not the wary tolerance of the last 4 days. Something else. Something that had not quite made up its mind what it was. "Miss Finch," he said. "Clara," she said. "If we're going to fight Rance Whitmore together, you may as well use my name." Another long silence. "Clara," he said, "why would you do this?" She thought about it honestly, because she respected honest answers. "Because someone lied to you," she said, "and because those 40 acres are yours, and it matters that things belong to who they actually belong to." She held his gaze. "And because I am standing on your land. Mr. Holt and I would like to know whether I'm standing on something that's going to hold." He didn't answer immediately. But he didn't look away either. And somewhere on the eastern fence line of the Holt Ranch, with the sun overhead and the problem between them, something shifted. Not enough to name yet. Not enough to trust. But enough. What Clara did not know as she stood on that fence line was that Rance Whitmore already knew she was there, and that Daniel Holt had an enemy who was not above using a woman no one expected to matter to get what he wanted. And that the receipt folded in her hand was the least dangerous piece of paper she would find before this was over. The Dusty Creek County Record Office smelled like old paper and dried ink, and the particular kind of institutional neglect that accumulates when nobody important has needed anything from a place in a long time. Clara arrived at 8 in the morning, when the clerk, a soft-faced man named Purvis, who looked startled to have a visitor before 9, was still unlocking the cabinet drawers. She had walked the 3 miles from the Holt Ranch alone because Daniel had offered to bring her in the wagon, and she had declined. She needed the time to think, and she needed him to understand that she was capable of moving through this town without an escort. Purvis looked at her the way men in small towns look at women they don't recognize, with a particular combination of curiosity and mild suspicion, as if her presence required an explanation. "I'd like to review the land transfer records for the southern boundary parcels in this county," Clara said, setting her notebook on the counter. "Specifically, anything filed in the last 18 months related to the Holt Ranch holdings." Purvis blinked. Those are public records, ma'am, but..." "Yes?" Clara said. "They are. I'd like to see them, please." He brought her 3 ledger volumes and a stack of loose filings that had not yet been bound, and he watched her from his desk with the helpless expression of a man who had expected a quiet morning and was not getting one. Clara sat at the reading table and opened the first ledger and began. She had learned to read county records the hard way, sitting on a hard chair in a Kansas office for 4 months after her father's first land loss, teaching herself the language of deeds and transfers and chain of title notations, until she could move through them the way a person moves through their own house in the dark. The language was formal and sometimes deliberately obscure, but the logic underneath it was simple. Every piece of land had a history, and that history had to be written down somewhere, and if the history was real, the writing would be consistent. If it wasn't real, it wouldn't be. She found the Whitmore filing 40 minutes in. It was in the loose stack not yet properly filed, which was itself a detail she noted. A deed typed, rather than handwritten, claiming a 40-acre parcel, described by boundary markers that matched Daniel's southern pasture precisely. The deed was dated 1849 and attributed to a land grant from the original Texas territorial period, signed over through a chain of 3 subsequent owners, the last of whom had apparently died in 1881 in Abilene, Kansas, leaving his estate, including this parcel, to a distant relation whose name appeared on no other document in any of the 3 ledger volumes. Clara set the deed aside and worked backward through the chain. The first transfer was plausible. The second was thinner. The signatures matched too well across a supposed 20-year gap, the handwriting too consistent for documents supposedly produced by different clerks in different counties. The third transfer had a notarization stamp from a Kansas county that Clara knew from her time in Wichita had not had an active notary office in the year the stamp claimed. She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote it down. Carefully. Every detail. She was reaching for the 4th ledger when the door opened behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She finished writing her sentence. Then she turned. The man in the doorway was not Daniel Holt. He was perhaps 50, dressed in the careful way of men who want to be taken for respectable without quite achieving it, a suit that was good quality but worn at the cuffs, a hat held in 2 hands in a gesture of courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. He was looking at the ledgers on her table and then at her, and his expression was the particular expression of a man who has walked into a room and found something he did not expect and is deciding what to do about it. "Miss Finch," he said. She had not introduced herself to anyone in this building. Purvis did not know her name. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "Garrett," he said. "Warren Garrett. I'm an attorney in this county." A pause. "I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Daniel Holt." Clara set down her pen. So this was the lawyer, the one who had recommended Territorial Land Services. The one Daniel had trusted on the strength of a county clerk's recommendation and who had handed him directly into the fraud. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "what brings you to the record office this morning?" "Same as yourself, I imagine," he said pleasantly. "Research." He walked to the counter and said something quiet to Purvis, and Purvis nodded and disappeared into the back room. Then Garrett pulled out the chair across the reading table and sat down in it uninvited and looked at the ledgers in front of her with an expression that was trying to be relaxed and wasn't quite making it. "I want to offer you some advice," he said. "I don't recall asking for any. Nonetheless," he leaned forward slightly, "Mr. Holt's situation is more complicated than it appears from the outside. There are legal obligations already in motion that make the outcome of this dispute less open than you might think. I've represented Daniel's interests for 3 years in this county, and I can tell you that the most productive path for all parties is a negotiated settlement." "A settlement," Clara said. "That gives Whitmore the 40 acres. Garrett smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been told he is charming often enough to believe it. "That gives everyone something workable. Mr. Holt keeps the ranch. Mr. Whitmore gets the parcel he has a legitimate claim to. Everyone moves forward." Clara looked at him steadily. "The claim isn't legitimate." The smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "That's a strong statement," he said. "It's an accurate one." She did not look down at her notes. She had already committed the relevant details to memory. The notarization on the 1873 transfer is stamped by a county office that had no active notary in that year. The handwriting on the first and second transfer signatures is consistent in a way that suggests the same hand produced both documents across a supposed 23-year interval. And the chain of title between the original 1849 grant and the current claim has a 15-year gap in the 1860s with no recorded tax assessments, which means either the land was abandoned without legal abandonment proceedings or the records were manufactured. She paused. "I believe it's the second." Garrett was very still. When he spoke, the pleasantness was gone. Not replaced by anger, replaced by something quieter and more deliberate. "You've been here less than an hour." I read quickly. "Miss Finch." He set his hat on the table between them. "You are a mail-order bride from Kansas who arrived in this county 4 days ago. You have no legal standing in this dispute. You have no professional credentials in property law. And you are involving yourself in a matter that has implications beyond what you can currently see." Another pause. I strongly suggest you focus on whatever domestic arrangement brought you here and allow the legal process to work as it's intended. Clara picked up her pen. Mr. Garrett, she said, you recommended to Daniel Holt that he pay Territorial Land Services for an assessment fee. Territorial Land Services is controlled by Rance Whitmore. That means you directed your client to pay money to his opponent in an active land dispute, which is either a profound conflict of interest or something considerably worse. She looked up. I'm going to finish reviewing these records. You're welcome to stay and watch, or you're welcome to leave. But I would suggest that whatever conversation you're planning to have with Mr. Whitmore afterward, you think carefully about what you say. Garrett stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, somewhere between rage and a reluctant recalibration. You don't know this town, he said. No, Clara said, but I know these records, and right now the records are more useful. He left. Purvis came back from the back room 30 seconds later and looked at the empty chair across from Clara with the expression of a man who had been listening through a door and was trying to pretend otherwise. Clara turned back to the ledger. She had 4 more hours of work to do. She walked back to the ranch in the afternoon with 7 pages of notes in her notebook and a copy she had carefully transcribed of the most significant discrepancies in the Whitmore deed chain. She had asked Purvis for permission to transcribe, and he had given it with the air of someone who was no longer sure what the rules were and had decided that agreeing was safer than refusing. Daniel was waiting on the porch steps when she came up the lane. He was not a man who waited visibly for things she had already learned that much about him. He managed his expressions the way he managed his land, with control, with attention to what was necessary, with a careful avoidance of anything that looked like need. But he was sitting on those porch steps at 3 in the afternoon, when he should have been at the south pasture, and when she came through the gate, he stood up the way a person stands, when they have been sitting still too long, because they were thinking too hard to move. Garrett came to see me, he said when she was close enough to talk. Clara stopped walking. When? An hour ago. He said you'd been at the record office. Daniel's voice was measured, but she could hear something underneath it. An edge, not of anger exactly, but of the particular tension that builds in a man who has been sitting with something he doesn't know how to respond to. He said you confronted him. I told him what I found, Clara said. I wouldn't call that a confrontation. What did you find? She opened the notebook. She showed him the transcription. She walked him through it the same way she had worked through it herself, methodically, without drama, point by point, letting the facts accumulate their own weight. Daniel was quiet through all of it. He was a good listener when he chose to be, she had noticed. He did not interrupt. He did not jump ahead. He waited for each piece before he reached for the next one. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The notarization, he said. You're certain? I verified it against the Wichita County records from my time there. That office had no registered notary from 1871 to 1875. The stamp is dated 1873. She closed the notebook. Garrett knows I found it. That's why he came to you. He's worried about what you'll do with it. Daniel looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him yet. It was the look of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for long enough that he has forgotten other arrangements are possible, and who is confronted suddenly with evidence to the contrary. Why? He said. She had expected a different question. Why what? Why are you doing this? Not a question the way he said it, more like something he was thinking out loud. You came here on a contract. I humiliated you on a train platform in front of half this town. I have given you no reason to... He stopped. Started again. You could be writing to the agency right now. You could be on the next train back to Kansas. Clara held his gaze. I could, she said. But you're not. No. Why? She thought about all the true answers, the ones that were complicated, the ones that were personal, the ones that had to do with 11 years of doing necessary work without being asked and without being thanked, and the particular feeling of standing in front of a solvable problem with the tools to solve it. She thought about the farm in Wichita that she had kept alive, and the father who had never once said her name with any particular pride, and the sister who had been beautiful enough to be excused from understanding how the world actually worked. She thought about those porch boards shifting under her weight on the first day. "Because the land is yours," she said. "And because someone lied to you and used your money against you, and that's wrong, and I know how to prove it's wrong." She paused. "And because I am standing on something I'd like to be sure is solid, Mr. Holt. It was solid before Whitmore came. I'd like to help make it solid again." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Daniel." She blinked. "My name," he said. "You told me to use yours. I think the same terms apply." Clara nodded once. "Daniel." The porch steps creaked as he shifted his weight, and she felt them flex slightly under her own feet as she stood beside him, and she thought about the work it would take to replace them and put that thought in the appropriate place in her mind, which was the place for things that could wait. The things that could not wait were inside the notebook. "Garrett is going to go to Whitmore," she said. "Tonight, probably. He'll tell him what I found, and they'll decide together what the next move is." She looked at Daniel. "We need to get to a federal land office before they do. The county system is compromised, Garrett has the clerk. But the federal territorial records aren't under local jurisdiction. If I can get a federal examiner to review the discrepancies in the deed chain, the county clerk's cooperation with Whitmore doesn't matter." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "The nearest federal land office is in San Marcos, 3 hours by train." "Then we should go tomorrow." "We." "Unless you'd prefer to go alone," Clara said. "I'm happy to write down everything I found and send it with you." He almost said something she could see it, and then he didn't. "No," he said. "We." Margaret was not pleased. That was Clara had come to understand Margaret's default condition, where Clara was concerned, and trying to change it was not a productive use of energy. What surprised Clara was what Margaret was not pleased about this time, because it turned out to be something different from what she expected. She found out at dinner, which was a meal Clara had prepared because no one else had, and which Daniel ate with the slightly uncomfortable gratitude of a man who has been eating badly for long enough that something decent surprises him. Margaret ate with the focused attention of someone who is tasting an argument they haven't voiced yet, and finding it increasingly hard to contain. "You're going to San Marcos," Margaret said, setting down her fork. "Yes," Daniel said. "With her." "With Clara," Daniel said. Margaret's eyes moved to Clara and back to Daniel with the swift precision of a woman who has spent years learning to read rooms. "People will talk." "People are already talking," Daniel said. "This is different. Going to a federal office together, it's a statement. It says I'm addressing the land dispute with the assistance of someone who knows what she's doing," Daniel said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something that was done with having the same conversation. "The alternative is losing the southern pasture and the water rights and reducing the herd by a third, which means reducing the hands, which means this ranch becomes something significantly smaller and less viable than it is now. I would like to avoid that." Margaret turned to Clara. "How do you know what you know?" she asked. It wasn't friendly, but it was a genuine question which was more than Clara had gotten from her before. "About deeds, about records. You're a farm woman from Kansas." "My father lost 40 acres when I was 19, Clara said. "I spent 4 months learning how it happened. Then I spent 11 years making sure it didn't happen again." She paused. "It happened again anyway, because my father kept making decisions I couldn't prevent. But I know what to look for." Margaret studied her. Something in her expression shifted, not warmth, still not that, but a hairline adjustment in the angle of her skepticism. "And you think you can stop this?" "I think the evidence is there to stop it," Clara said. "Whether it stops it depends on whether a federal examiner agrees with my reading, which is not certain, but it's considerably more certain than whatever Garrett was planning to do on Daniel's behalf." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "She humiliated us," Margaret said, but she said it to Daniel, not to Clara. "On the platform, in front of everyone. She was humiliated on the platform first, Daniel said quietly, in front of everyone. That was the most he had said about the platform since it happened. Clara did not look at him when he said it. She looked at her plate, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not entirely want to examine, and she put it in the place where she put things that needed to wait. Margaret picked up her fork again. She did not say another word during dinner. They left for San Marcos on the 7 o'clock train. Daniel had brought his original deed, the tax records going back to his father's time, and the correspondence from Whitmore's lawyer. Clara had her notebook, her transcriptions, and a copy of the March receipt she had borrowed from Daniel's desk the evening before, without asking, reasoning that it was his receipt and she would give it back when they were done with it. The train car was half empty at that hour, which meant the other passengers were close enough to overhear but spread out enough that the conversation could stay reasonably private. Daniel sat across from her, and she opened her notebook, and they went through the argument she was planning to present to the federal examiner, the way you go through a structure before you trust your weight to it, looking for the weak points, the places where a challenge could get in. He was sharp about it. That surprised her. And then it didn't, because she had been underestimating him in the same way he had underestimated her, and she was trying to stop doing that. The 1873 notarization is the strongest point, he said. What about the handwriting comparison? Can you prove same hand without an expert? I can document the inconsistencies well enough that an examiner would want an expert to look, Clara said. That's sufficient for now. We don't need to win the case today. We need to get the federal office involved, which removes the county system from having final authority. And if the examiner dismisses it, then we go to the territorial governor's land commissioner. It's slower, but the chain of authority doesn't stop at the examiner. She paused. Daniel, Whitmore has done this before. He's won twice. The fact that he's won before means there are other parties who have records of fighting him, other ranchers, other disputed deeds. If I can locate even one case where his manufactured deed chain was documented, how would you locate that? By writing to the attorneys who lost those cases and asking. She met his eyes. Lawyers who lose to the same fraud twice usually have opinions about it. Daniel looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was not quite comfort and not quite assessment, but something that lived between them, a recalibration that was happening slowly and without announcement. You've thought about this longer than one day, he said. I thought about most of it last night, Clara said. I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places. He was quiet for a moment. Then, neither do I. She didn't ask why. She had the feeling it was something he wouldn't answer directly yet, and she had learned to leave space for things that needed time. Outside the window, Texas moved past them at 30 miles an hour, vast and indifferent. The federal land office in San Marcos was run by an examiner named Aldous Birch, who was 62 years old, had been doing this job for 19 years, and had the permanent expression of a man who has seen every kind of fraud attempted on federal paperwork and has developed a comprehensive contempt for all of them. He looked at Clara when Daniel introduced her and said, "You're his wife." "No," Clara said. "I'm his associate." Birch raised both eyebrows but said nothing further, which she interpreted as acceptance. She laid the case out in 30 minutes because she had organized it on the train into something that could be understood in 30 minutes by someone who knew the relevant law. She presented the deed discrepancies in order of severity. The notarization problem first, because it was the most verifiable, then the handwriting consistency, then the gap in the tax assessment chain. She showed Birch her transcriptions and her notes, and the original receipt from Territorial Land Services, and she explained precisely without editorializing what she believed the receipt documented. Birch listened without interrupting. He was the best kind of listener, the kind who is already working the problem while you're still talking. When she finished, he picked up the transcription of the 1873 notarization and read it. He read it twice. Then he looked at Daniel. "You've had Garrett representing you in this?" "Until recently," Daniel said. Birch set down the paper. "Garrett did a deed transfer review for a ranch in Hayes County 3 years ago. Whitmore was involved in that dispute too. He said it without inflection, but his eyes moved to Clara when he said it, and she understood he was telling her something important. That case settled. I always thought it settled fast. Clara kept her voice neutral. Do you have the records from that case? I have federal records from all cases that came to this office. Birch stood up. Give me 20 minutes. He came back in 15. What he put on the desk in front of Clara was a deed from the Hayes County dispute 3 years old. Whitmore's competing claim, a different 40-acre parcel, a different ranch. A different chain of title. The same notarization stamp, the same date, the same county office that had no active notary in 1873. Clara looked at it for a long moment. One stamp, she said almost to herself. He used the same fraudulent stamp twice. Birch was already reaching for a different drawer. He may have used it more than twice. What they found in the next 2 hours changed the shape of everything. Birch had records of 4 separate land disputes in 3 counties over the past 8 years, in which Whitmore's organization had appeared as the claimant. In 2 of those cases, the cases Whitmore had won the deeds had settled without federal review. In one other, the competing rancher had died before the case resolved. In the 4th, the claim had been withdrawn. Birch noted dryly that the rancher in that case had simply paid Whitmore to go away. In 3 of the 4 cases, Birch could identify document characteristics that matched what Clara had found in Daniel's records. The notarization stamp appeared in 2 of them. The handwriting consistency appeared in all 3. This is a pattern, Clara said. This is a federal case, Birch said. He was sitting back in his chair with the energized stillness of a man who has been waiting for a particular thing for longer than he'd like to admit. Mr. Holt, I'm going to open a formal investigation into the competing claim on your parcel. That means the county proceedings are stayed pending federal review. Whitmore cannot advance his claim through county court while this office is examining the deed chain. Daniel was very still. How long does the investigation take? 60 to 90 days for a preliminary finding. If the preliminary finding supports what Miss Finch has documented, the case goes to the Territorial Land Commissioner for adjudication. Birch looked at Clara. Where did you learn to read deed chains? Necessity, Clara said. Birch almost smiled. Well, the federal government of the United States is glad for your necessity, Miss Finch. They caught the late train back to Dusty Creek. The car was emptier than the morning train, and the night outside the windows was very dark. The kind of dark that belongs to open country, with no towns close enough to put light in the sky. Clara sat with her notebook closed on her lap, because there was nothing left to write, and felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from sustained concentration finally releasing. Daniel was across from her. He had been quiet since they left Birch's office, the thoughtful quiet of a man processing something significant. 60 to 90 days, he said. More likely 90, Clara said. These things run long, but the stay is effective immediately. Whitmore can't file in county court while the federal investigation is open, which means Garrett loses his leverage, which means Garrett has a decision to make about whether he wants to be connected to a federal fraud case. Clara paused. He'll probably contact Whitmore tonight. They'll try to figure out how this happened. She let that sit for a moment. They'll know it was me. Daniel looked at her directly. Does that concern you? She thought about it honestly. Some, she said. Men like Whitmore don't like being outmaneuvered by people they dismissed. She paused. But I've been dismissed before. I know how to move in it. He was quiet for a moment. On the platform, he said. She waited. I said what I said because you were not what I expected, he said. I want to be clear that the fault in that was entirely mine. Clara looked at him across the dark train car. I know, she said. That's not an apology, he said. I mean it is, but I want to say more than that. He stopped, tried again. I was looking for a solution to a loneliness problem, and I wrote to an agency as if I was ordering a piece of equipment, and when what arrived didn't match my expectation, I treated you as if the problem was you. He held her gaze. The problem was the expectation. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "You're a difficult man to know," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "I've been told that." "But you're trying," she said. "I can see that you're trying." He nodded, looked at his hands for a moment, looked back at her. "You fixed my porch boards this morning," he said. "Before we left, I saw you." She had done it at 6 in the morning with the tools from the barn because the boards were dangerous and someone had to. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. "They were going to fail before winter," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to—" He stopped. "I've been meaning to do a number of things." "I know," she said quietly. Outside the window, Texas was dark and enormous and indifferent, and the train moved through it at 30 miles an hour, and inside the car, there was a silence that was different from the silences that had come before. Not cold, not wary. Not the managed distance of two people negotiating the terms of something difficult. Something closer to the particular quiet of two people who have been working alongside each other and have arrived without planning to, at the edge of something neither of them knows yet how to name. Clara looked out the dark window. She was not going to name it tonight. She was going to put it in the place where she put things that needed time, and she was going to do the next necessary thing, and the next one after that, and she was going to trust that truth had a way of finding the surface eventually. She always had. What she did not know, sitting on that train in the Texas dark, was that Rance Whitmore was not a man who waited for federal investigations to unfold, and that by the time she and Daniel returned to Dusty Creek, someone had already been through the ranch records she had left on the study desk. And something was missing. They knew before they reached the front door. Cal was waiting at the gate, not in the casual way of a man who happened to be standing there, but in the tense, deliberate way of someone who has been waiting because he has bad news and has decided that the person who needs to hear it should hear it before they walk into the house. He held Daniel's horse without being asked and looked at Clara when he spoke, which told her something about how his understanding of the situation had shifted in the past 48 hours. "Someone was in the study," he said. "Mary went in to clean this morning and found the desk turned over, papers on the floor." He paused. "Front door wasn't forced. Either they had a key or someone left it unlocked." Daniel was already moving toward the house. Clara followed without breaking stride. The study was exactly what Cal had described, not ransacked in the theatrical way of someone trying to frighten, but searched in the precise way of someone looking for something specific. The desk had been gone through drawer by drawer, the contents not scattered but displaced, moved and replaced with the controlled urgency of hands that knew what they were after. The ledger volumes were still on the shelves. The correspondence files were still in their box. But the stack of working papers she had left on the desk, her organized reconstruction of the vendor records, the cross-referenced receipts, the timeline she had built, connecting the Territorial Land Service's payment to the sequence of events in the dispute, was gone. Every page. Clara stood in the middle of the room and did the accounting quickly. What was taken, what wasn't. What the choice of what to take revealed about what the person knew and what they were afraid of. "They didn't touch the ledgers," she said. Daniel turned from the desk. "What?" "The ledgers are still here. The original vendor receipts are still in the box. They took my working papers, the analysis, the timeline, the connections I drew between the Territorial Land Service's payment and Whitmore's network." She looked at Daniel. "They knew exactly what I'd been working on. They didn't come in here blind. Someone told them what to look for." "Garrett," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. He knew I'd been at the record office. He knew what I'd found. And he came to you the same afternoon, which means he also knew I'd brought my notes back here. She looked around the room once more methodically. He would have told Whitmore. Whitmore decided the analysis was dangerous enough to remove. "They broke into my house." "Yes," Clara said. "Which means they're frightened. Frightened people make mistakes." She moved to the shelf where the ledgers were. "The originals are still here. I can rebuild the analysis from the source documents. It'll take longer, but the conclusions will be the same." She turned to face him. They didn't get what they thought they were getting. My transcriptions from the record office are in my notebook, which was in my bag on the train. She held up the notebook. Daniel looked at it, and then at her, and something moved through his expression that was part relief and part something harder to categorize. You kept it with you, he said. I keep everything important with me, she said. That's something you learn when you grow up in a house where things go missing. Cal had more to tell them, and he told it at the kitchen table that evening, with the directness of a man who has decided that honesty is the only useful currency. He had been with Daniel for 11 years. He knew the land and the operation and the history the way a person knows the back of their own hand, and he had been watching the Whitmore situation develop for 6 months, with the constrained fury of someone who can see a wrong being done and can't find the right tool to stop it. There's something I didn't tell you before, he said to Daniel, because I wasn't sure it was my place. Tell me now, Daniel said. Cal set his hat on the table. Whitmore approached me in April, came out to the east fence when I was working alone, offered me $200 to give him access to the ranch records. He looked at his hands. I told him to leave the property. He left. The kitchen was very quiet. You didn't tell me, Daniel said. I was going to. Cal looked up. And then Garrett started coming around with the settlement talk, and you were already overwhelmed with it, and He stopped. I should have told you immediately. I know that. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Clara watched him manage the anger and the hurt and the practical reality of having a foreman who had made the wrong call for the right reasons, and she watched him arrive at the place where a man decides what a thing is actually worth. $200 is more than 2 months' wages, Daniel said. Yes, Cal said. And you said no. Yes. Then you did the right thing. The telling should have been sooner, but the decision was right. Daniel looked at him steadily. Is there anything else? Cal reached into his shirt pocket and put something on the table. It was a folded piece of paper slightly worn at the creases. He left this when he went. Said to think it over. I kept it because I thought it might matter later. Clara reached for it before Daniel could, not out of presumption, but out of reflex, the reflex of someone who knows that documents need to be handled carefully by hands that know what they're looking at. She unfolded it. It was a letter. Brief, handwritten on paper that had a letterhead she recognized Territorial Land Services. It was addressed to Calvin Reed, and it offered in careful language $200 in exchange for facilitation of access to operational records of the Holt Ranch holdings for the purposes of legitimate land assessment. Signed by Rance Whitmore. Clara read it twice. Then she looked at Cal. Did he touch anything in the house that day? Any surface? Any door? Cal frowned. He came to the fence. He never came inside. Did he hand you this letter directly? Yes. Put it in my hand. She held the letter by the edges. His handwriting, she said quietly. Signed by him. Offering money for access to ranch records during an active land dispute. She looked at Daniel. This is solicitation of evidence tampering. If Whitmore personally signed this letter, it connects him directly to an attempt to corrupt the documentation of a case that is now under federal review. The kitchen was very quiet again. Daniel looked at the letter in her hands with the expression of a man who has been fighting in the dark for months and has just been handed a lamp. Can we use it? He said. We can use it, Clara said. We bring this to Birch along with everything else. It goes into the federal file. She set it flat on the table, still holding only the edges. Cal, I need you to write down tonight in your own words exactly what happened at that fence. Date, time, what he said, what you said, what he gave you, what he did when he left. Sign it. I'll witness it. Cal looked at her for a moment, the look of a man recalibrating something. Yes, ma'am, he said. Margaret came into the kitchen while Cal was writing his statement, took in the scene, the letter on the table, the notebook open beside it. Clara, sitting with her pen watching Cal's careful handwriting progress across the page, and sat down, without being invited or asked. Which was the first time she had done anything like that since Clara arrived. She read the Whitmore letter over Clara's shoulder. "He actually signed it," Margaret said. "Arrogant men usually do," Clara said. "They don't expect the person they hand something to keep it." Margaret was quiet. Then, "What happens to Garrett?" "That depends on how much he knew and when," Clara said. "If he knew Territorial Land Services was Whitmore's company when he recommended the payment, he's involved in the fraud. If he only knew after, he's potentially just a very bad attorney." She paused. "I think he knew." "So do I," Margaret said. That surprised Clara enough that she looked up. Margaret's jaw was tight. He told Daniel the payment would resolve things quietly. He said it with too much confidence, like he knew what the outcome would be because he'd already arranged it. She looked at the table rather than at Clara. "I told Daniel he shouldn't trust Garrett. Daniel thought I was being difficult." Clara looked at Daniel. He had the expression of a man who is being told something he already knows and doesn't enjoy knowing. "You said you didn't like his handshake," Daniel said. "I said I didn't trust men who shake hands like they're doing you a favor," Margaret said, "which is what I meant." Clara turned back to Cal's statement. "Add that," she said to Daniel, "in the record, that Garrett expressed certainty about the outcome of the payment before it was made. It's not evidence by itself, but context matters." "You're building a case," Margaret said. "I'm building a record," Clara said. "A case is what happens after." Margaret was quiet for another moment. Then she said something Clara did not expect. "I was wrong about you," she said. Not warmly, not with apology exactly, but with the precise, controlled honesty of a woman who says things she doesn't find comfortable when she has decided they need to be said. "I don't know yet if you're right for my brother. That's a separate question. But I was wrong about the kind of person you are." Clara looked at her steadily. "I know," she said. "I assumed you'd get there eventually." Margaret made a sound that in different circumstances might have been a laugh. The next morning brought Whitmore himself. Clara heard the wagon coming up the lane from the kitchen where she was working through the rebuilt timeline from the original documents, and she looked out in time to see a wagon with 2 men on the bench and a third on horseback alongside it. The man on horseback was Whitmore. She knew him from the description Daniel had given, and from the quality of the horse, which was the kind of quality that announces itself. He was perhaps 55, built in the solid, deliberate way of a man who has spent decades making himself difficult to move. He wore a good coat and a bad expression, and when he swung down from the horse, it was with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that how you arrive matters as much as what you say when you get there. Daniel was already on the porch. Clara stayed at the kitchen window for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to understand what was happening. Then she dried her hands on the dishcloth and walked to the front door and stood in it, not stepping out, but visible. Whitmore looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who has made a habit of assessing threats quickly and discarding the ones that don't concern him. He looked at Clara, and he discarded her immediately, which told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. "Holt," he said, "I think we need to talk about the situation in San Marcos." "I think we don't," Daniel said. "I think the Federal Land Office handles our communication from here." Whitmore smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "The federal office is going to find what I tell them to find. I have friends in San Marcos, Daniel. Birch is one examiner. There are others." "Birch seemed quite interested in what he already found," Daniel said. "He's interested in everything. He's also 62 years old and 2 years from retirement and very concerned about his pension." Whitmore spread his hands. "I'm not your enemy. I'm a businessman. The settlement I offered you in April was fair. It's still fair. You keep 360 acres the water rights for the north and east pastures, the full operation minus the southern tributary access. You adjust the herd size. You move on." He paused. "Or you spend 90 days in federal proceedings that cost you money and legal fees, and you lose anyway, and you lose more badly because now you've made things difficult. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. Whitmore's pleasant expression didn't change. "Daniel." "The answer is no," Daniel said. "It was no in April, and it's no now." Whitmore turned to look at Clara again, and this time the assessment took longer. She stood in the doorway and looked back at him, and didn't flinch, and didn't perform anything, and she could see the moment he decided she was not a negligible quantity after all. "You're the mail-order bride," he said. It was contemptuous by design, and it landed exactly as designed, and Clara let it land without moving. "I'm the woman who found the fraudulent notarization on your deed chain," she said, "and who documented your pattern across 4 counties for Examiner Birch yesterday." She paused. "And who is currently in possession of a letter in your handwriting soliciting evidence tampering from Mr. Holt's foreman." She held his gaze. "So if you have friends in San Marcos, Mr. Whitmore, you should contact them today, because the window for this to stay a civil matter is closing." The silence on that porch was the kind of silence that happens when a room recalibrates around a statement. Whitmore looked at her for a very long time. Then he looked at Daniel. "Where did you find her?" he said. Not to Clara, to Daniel. And it was not a compliment, and it was not entirely. Not a compliment. It was the involuntary response of a man who has been surprised enough that his language slipped before he could control it. "Kansas," Daniel said. Whitmore put his hat back on. He looked at the 2 men on the wagon bench who had the carefully neutral expressions of men being paid to be present, but not to have opinions. He looked back at Daniel. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Daniel said, "but it's different now." Whitmore got back on his horse. The wagon turned in the lane. They watched him go. When the sound of hooves was far enough down the road, Daniel turned to Clara. "You told him about the letter," he said. "Yes, we hadn't decided to do that yet." "I decided in the moment," she said. "He needed to know that we have it before he contacts anyone in San Marcos. A man who knows we have written evidence against him in his own hand thinks twice about how many more crimes he commits in the next 30 days. She looked at Daniel. "I should have consulted you. I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. "Don't be," he said. "You were right." 2. The town's opinion shifted in the way of small towns. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but through the gradual osmosis of 100 small observations accumulating into a new consensus. It started with Purvis at the record office, who had watched Clara dismantle Garrett in his reading room, and had apparently told his wife, who had told 3 other women. And the story had moved from there with the particular velocity of something that gives a community permission to feel a way it was already starting to feel. Clara became aware of it on her 3rd trip to town, when the woman who ran the dry goods store said good morning to her without the careful neutrality of someone managing their face. When the man who managed the livery touched his hat when she passed. Small things. The kind of small things that add up to belonging, or at least to not being outside. She did not let herself feel it too much. She had been in this town 11 days. 11 days was not enough for anything definitive, but she noticed it. She also noticed Garrett, who she saw once from across the main street. He was walking fast with the contained urgency of a man trying not to look like he was fleeing something. He did not look at her. She watched him until he turned a corner, and then she went on about her business. That evening, she found Daniel in the study, properly at the desk, working through correspondence with the focused attention of a man who has remembered that he runs a cattle operation, and that cattle operations require continuous management regardless of what else is happening. She set a cup of coffee on the desk beside him without being asked which she had started doing in the evenings, and he accepted it without comment, which he had started doing in response. "Birch sent a message," Daniel said without looking up from the letter he was reading. "Formal acknowledgement of the investigation. Effective immediately, the county proceedings are stayed." "Good," Clara said. She sat in the other chair. He also said. Daniel stopped. He set down the letter. He picked up a second piece of paper that was smaller than the first and looked at it. He said the examination of the other cases has been assigned to a second examiner. The pattern you identified across 4 counties has been formally documented." He looked at her. He used the word compelling. Clara absorbed that. "That's good. That means even if someone leans on Birch, there's a second examiner who has seen the pattern independently." He also said something else. Daniel held the paper toward her. She took it and read the last paragraph of Birch's message. It said, "Miss Finch's analysis demonstrated a command of deed chain evaluation that this office rarely encounters outside of professional appraisers. Should she ever seek formal employment in land record examination, I would be glad to provide a letter of recommendation." Clara set the paper down. She was not sure what to do with that. She put it in the place where she put things that needed time. "You could," Daniel said. "If you wanted to. That's a real offer." "I know," she said. "It would take you away from here." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and the careful management of his expression had slipped the way it sometimes did in the evenings in the study when the day was done and he was too tired to maintain all the distances he normally kept. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not until this is finished." "And after it's finished?" She held his gaze for a moment. "That depends on several things," she said. "Some of which I'm still working out." He nodded. He didn't push it, which she had come to understand was one of his better qualities, the ability to leave space for things that weren't ready to be said. She looked at the desk. "You have 3 vendor contracts that need response before Friday," she said. He picked up his pen. "I know. The south pasture fence needs 2 new posts before the fall rains. Cal knows. And your flower bin is still not properly restocked." He looked up at her with something that was almost in the particular light of the study lamp, almost a smile. "Are you going to manage my household or my legal problems?" he said. "Both," Clara said. "They're not separate problems. They're the same problem. A ranch that isn't maintained loses value. A ranch that loses land loses viability. It's all one thing." He looked at her for a moment. "You see it like that, all connected." "Don't you?" "I used to," he said. "Before this year." A pause. "I got narrowed. By the dispute. I stopped seeing the whole and started only seeing the threat." Clara nodded. That's what Whitmore wanted. A man who's only looking at the threat stops managing everything else. Then the everything else starts to fail. Then he's got less to fight with. She paused. "It's a very effective strategy. You've seen it before." "My father did it for 11 years, she said. "I watched what it cost him." Daniel was quiet. "What did it cost him?" he asked, and this time it wasn't about the legal strategy or the land management. It was a different kind of question. Clara thought about the farm in Wichita. Her father's hands, which had been capable once and had gradually become hands that held things without purpose. Her mother, who had died young, and to whom Clara had ascribed no particular feeling for years because she hadn't been permitted to, and to whom she now sometimes spoke in her head in the evenings when the day's work was done, and she was too tired for the careful management of her own interior landscape. Everything, she said. He let the threat narrow him until there was nothing left but the fear of it. And then he lost the thing he was afraid of losing anyway, because he'd already stopped fighting for it. Daniel looked at her. "I'm not going to do that," he said. "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm still here." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it was not from Birch. It was from Kansas. From her sister Ruth, written in Ruth's looping, generous handwriting on paper that smelled faintly of the lavender Ruth kept in her drawer. Clara opened it at the kitchen table in the morning before Daniel was up, and she read it with the particular internal bracing of someone who has learned that letters from home rarely contain only good news. Ruth wrote that their father's health was failing. Not suddenly, the way it had been declining for 2 years had simply continued, and now the doctor had said what everyone had been not saying for months. Ruth wrote that she was managing, and that their father asked about Clara sometimes, and that she didn't know what to tell him. Ruth wrote that she was to be married in the spring to a man named Ellsworth, who was decent and steady and not exciting, and that she thought this was probably the right kind of man for her, and that she hoped Clara was well. She wrote at the very end, "Everyone here says you were foolish to go so far away for a man who might not work out. I told them you were never foolish a day in your life, and if you went, you had a reason. I hope I was right. Write to me when you can." Clara folded the letter. She sat with it for a moment. Then she got up and started the bread because bread needed starting, and she was not going to sit in a kitchen and feel things about her father when there was work to be done. And she had made her decision about where she was and why she was there. Daniel found her an hour later, wrist deep in dough, and he read the expression on her face correctly enough that he didn't ask what was wrong, which was the right decision. Instead, he poured himself coffee and sat at the table and said, "Cal wants to start the south fence post this week if the weather holds." "Good," Clara said. "Tell him I'll help Thursday if he needs another set of hands." Daniel paused. "You know how to set fence posts." "I know how to do most things that need doing," Clara said. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. "My father never had enough help. I learned to fill in." He was quiet for a moment. What happened to him? She told him. Not all of it. Not the complicated interior architecture of a childhood spent being useful and unacknowledged, the specific grief of being the daughter who was capable and therefore expected and therefore taken for granted. But enough. She told him about the farm, about the boundary dispute she'd fought through the Wichita record office, about the second loss that happened anyway, because her father kept making decisions she couldn't prevent. She told him about Ruth, who was beautiful and kind and was marrying someone decent and steady in the spring. She told him about the day she'd sat down at the kitchen table in Wichita and opened the Westfield Matrimonial Agency's letter and thought with the particular clarity of someone who has been patient long enough, it's time to make a different decision. Daniel listened to all of it, the way he listened to everything completely without interrupting, waiting for each thing before reaching for the next. When she finished, he said, "You weren't running away." "No," she said. "You were running toward something." She looked at him. "I was moving toward something that wasn't already decided," she said. "That's different from running." He looked at his coffee cup. "I'm glad you came." It was a simple statement. It was not dressed up or qualified or managed. He said it the way people say true things when they have stopped performing around them. Clara pressed the dough into shape. "I know," she said. She did know. She had known it for a few days now, the way you know something that has been building gradually each day, adding its weight to the previous one until the thing is simply there. Solid like ground underfoot that you have tested without realizing you were testing it. She was not going to say more than that tonight. There were still things that needed time. The investigation had 60 days still on its clock. Whitmore was not finished. Garrett was still in this county. The ranch had vendor contracts and fence posts and a flower bin. She knew what mattered and she knew the order in which it had to be handled. But she also knew as she shaped the bread, and Daniel sat at the table with his coffee in the quiet morning, that something had been decided. Not by announcement. Not by any formal conversation. Just by the accumulation of days lived alongside each other, and the particular kind of trust that builds when two people keep choosing to work on the same problems together. She was not invisible here. She was not the forgotten one, the overlooked one, the one who was handed a broom while the other one was handed the future. She was Clara Finch, who had read a deed chain wrong side up and found a fraudulent notarization stamp and walked into a federal land office and changed the shape of a problem that had been crushing a good man for 6 months. She was the woman who fixed the porch boards before 6 in the morning and rebuilt the analysis from source documents and stood in the doorway while Rance Whitmore tried to dismiss her and did not flinch. She was beginning to understand exactly where she had been moving toward all along. What she did not know yet, what was still 3 days away, arriving on the same Tuesday mail run as a notice from the federal land office, was that Whitmore had made his last move. And it was not legal. And it was not against Daniel, it was against her. The notice arrived with the Tuesday mail tucked between a supply invoice and a letter from a cattle buyer in San Antonio, which was how dangerous things often arrived quietly between ordinary things, as if they had no particular weight. Clara was sorting this mail at the kitchen table when she found it. It was addressed to her. Not to Daniel Holt, not to the Holt Ranch. To Clara Finch by name at this address, which meant someone had taken the time to establish that she was here, that this was where she received correspondence, that she was a person specific enough to be targeted by name. She opened it. It was a single page typed from an attorney in Wichita named Caldwell. She did not know the name. She read it once quickly to get the shape of it, and then she read it again slowly to make sure she had the shape right. The Westfield Matrimonial Agency, the letter informed her, had received a complaint. The complaint alleged that Clara Finch had misrepresented her qualifications and background in the documentation submitted to the agency, specifically that she had claimed experience and capabilities she did not possess, and that this misrepresentation had caused material harm to the contracting party, one Daniel Holt, of Dusty Creek, Texas. The letter further alleged that Clara had, upon arrival at the Holt Ranch, inserted herself into legal matters beyond her competence, potentially compromising an existing legal defense and exposing Mr. Holt to additional liability. The agency was therefore opening a review of the contract and requesting that Clara Finch confirm her current status at the Holt Ranch and provide documentation of her claimed qualifications. The letter was signed by Caldwell on behalf of the agency. At the bottom, in smaller type, it noted that a copy had been forwarded to the office of the Territorial Governor's Land Commissioner. Clara set it down. She sat with it for 30 seconds, long enough to feel the precise shape of what was happening, to let herself know it, to stop the part of her mind that wanted to immediately start solving it, and let the part of her mind that was allowed to feel things do its work briefly. This was Whitmore's move. Not against Daniel, against her. Against her standing in the legal case, against her credibility with Birch's office, against the value of everything she had documented and submitted. If he could establish that she had misrepresented herself, that she was not who she said she was, that her analysis was the work of a fraud and not a competent woman, then the federal investigation lost its most compelling witness. Not legally, not formally, but in the way that things get lost in bureaucracies, through doubt, through delay, through the accumulated weight of a contested reputation. He was not trying to beat the evidence. He was trying to beat her. She picked up the letter and went to find Daniel. He was in the barn with Cal, working through a problem with one of the wagon wheels, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has learned to read her pace. She walked at her normal pace because she was not going to perform distress when what was needed was clarity. But he read something in her face anyway and straightened up from the wheel. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it. His jaw tightened, she could see it, and his hands went flat and still against the paper, the way hands go when a person is managing something they want to express physically and are choosing not to. "Whitmore," he said. "Yes." "He filed a complaint against you with the agency." He filed a complaint with the agency and sent a copy to the Land Commissioner's office, which is the office that would ultimately adjudicate the case against him. Clara kept her voice level. "He's trying to compromise my credibility with the examiner. If I'm officially under review for misrepresentation, anything I submitted becomes contestable." Cal had stopped pretending to work on the wheel. He was listening openly, and Clara had stopped minding that. He was part of this. "Can he do that?" Cal asked. "Just file a complaint and make it matter." "He can file a complaint," Clara said. "Whether it matters depends on how it's handled and how quickly." She looked at Daniel. "I need to respond to Caldwell directly, and I need to contact Birch before the Land Commissioner's office receives anything that could affect their perception of the investigation." "What do you need?" Daniel said. "My documentation from the Wichita Record Office. 4 years ago, I filed a formal response to a boundary dispute on behalf of my father's property. It's in the county record there, under Finch versus Harlow. That document establishes that I have a demonstrable history of exactly the work I've been doing here." She paused. "And I need character attestations. People who have known me, known my work, known the quality of my judgment." "I'll write one," Daniel said immediately. You're the contracting party, Clara said. Your attestation carries weight, but it also carries conflict of interest. I need others. Birch, Daniel said. He already put his assessment in writing, that he'd recommend you for professional work. That's exactly what I need, and I need it before Caldwell's letter reaches the land commissioner. She looked at the letter in Daniel's hands. I need to send a telegraph to San Marcos today. Daniel handed the letter back to her. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen before on his face, the one that was past assessment, past the careful management of distance, something more direct and more unguarded. This is because of you, he said. Because you helped me. He's going after you because he can't get to the evidence. Yes, Clara said. I'm sorry. Don't be, she said. Being attacked means you've done something worth attacking. I'd rather be here being attacked than in Wichita being irrelevant. She folded the letter. I'm going to town. I'll be back before dark. She was at the barn door when Daniel said her name. Not Miss Finch. Clara. He had been using her name for 3 weeks now, but he said it sometimes with a particular weight, and this was one of those times. She turned. He was standing by the wagon wheel with his hands at his sides, and he looked like a man who has a thing to say and hasn't finished deciding how to say it. I'll come with you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. They sent 2 telegraphs from the Dusty Creek office, one to Birch in San Marcos, one to the Wichita County Record Office, requesting certified documentation of the Finch versus Harlow filing. The telegraph operator, a young man named Estes, who was 17 and trying very hard not to look like he was paying attention, tapped out both messages with the focused precision of someone who understood that the content of what he was sending was significant without knowing exactly why. Daniel paid for the telegraphs without discussing it. Clara noted this and did not object, because there were things she could spend energy fighting and things she could let pass, and the telegraph fee was in the second category. Walking back along the main street, they passed the dry goods store, and the woman there nodded to both of them, to Daniel and to Clara equally, with the particular equanimity of someone who has made a decision about where they stand. 3 weeks ago, Clara had been the mistake that arrived on the train platform. Something had shifted, and she understood that what had shifted was not her, but the town's knowledge of her. She was aware at the same time that the complaint Whitmore had filed was designed to reverse exactly that shift. Garrett is leaving, Daniel said as they passed the law office. Clara looked. The door was shut. The window that had always had a lamp burning in it was dark. When? Margaret heard it from the banker's wife this morning. He submitted a letter to the County Bar Association last week. Voluntary withdrawal from practice in this county. Daniel's voice was flat. He didn't tell me. He's running, Clara said. He knows the federal investigation is going to turn his involvement over eventually. Getting out of this county before it does reduces his exposure. She paused. He's also removing himself as a local resource for Whitmore, which might mean Whitmore is paying less than Garrett expected. Or Garrett is smarter than Whitmore thinks he is, Daniel said. Or both. She walked for another half a block. His withdrawal doesn't hurt us. He wasn't representing you anymore. But it's useful to know it means the people around Whitmore are starting to calculate their own risks independently. The complaint against you doesn't look like the behavior of a man whose support is eroding, Daniel said. No, Clara said. It looks like the behavior of a man who has fewer options than he did 3 weeks ago and is choosing the most aggressive one that's left. She looked down the street. Cornered men are dangerous, but they're also more predictable than men who have room to maneuver. They had reached the wagon. Daniel put his hand on the side of it and turned to face her, and she turned with him because she could see he had something more to say. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to tell me the truth, even if the truth is something I don't want to hear. I always tell you the truth, Clara said. I know. He looked at her steadily. Are you staying because you're invested in the outcome of this case? Or are you staying because... He stopped, tried again. I want to know what you want, Clara. Not what the contract says, not what the investigation requires. What you actually want. The main street of Dusty Creek was moving around them, a horse passing two women talking outside the milliner's, the ordinary mid-morning business of a small town. Clara stood at the side of Daniel's wagon and thought about the question honestly, because he deserved an honest answer, and she had been working her way toward one for a while now. Both, she said. I'm not going to lie to you and say the case doesn't matter to me, because it does. I built that case. I want to see it through. She held his gaze. But if the case were finished tomorrow, I don't think I'd leave. I think I'd find the next thing that needed doing and do it. He was quiet. Because of the ranch, he said. Because of the ranch, she said. And because of the man who runs it. There it was. She had said it simply and directly, the way she said things she meant, and she watched him receive it, watched the careful management of his expression loosen around the edges, the way it did sometimes in the evenings in the study, when he was too tired to keep all the distances maintained. Clara, he said. You don't have to say anything back, she said. I'm not asking for a declaration. I'm answering your question honestly because you asked for honesty. She turned toward the wagon. We should get back. I want to start the written response to Caldwell before tonight. He put his hand on her arm. Not urgently, just there, present. She stopped. I'm not going to say nothing, he said. I'm not capable of letting you say a thing like that and saying nothing. She waited. I have been alone on this ranch for 2 years, he said. Not just without a wife. Alone, working a problem that kept getting bigger with fewer people I could trust, and I got narrowed the way you said. I stopped seeing the whole. He looked at her. You walked in and you saw everything. The porch boards and the flour bin and the ledger and the fraud and the pattern across 4 counties. You saw all of it, and you stayed anyway, and you started fixing things. A pause. I don't know what I thought a wife was supposed to be before you came. Something decorative, maybe. Something that made the house feel less empty. Another pause, shorter. I know better now. Clara looked at him. That's not nothing, she said. No, he said. It isn't. He let go of her arm. They got into the wagon. They drove back toward the ranch, and the Texas afternoon was wide and bright around them, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, not yet, but the solid preliminary feeling of something that has been built carefully enough to bear weight. Birch's response arrived the following morning faster than she'd expected, which told her he had taken the telegraph seriously. He had. The message was brief and decisive. The complaint filed with the Westfield agency had been noted, and the federal examination was proceeding on the strength of the documented evidence which had been produced through a review process that the office stood behind. A letter was being prepared for the Land Commissioner's office attesting to the quality and accuracy of the documentation provided by Miss Finch. Birch had added one line at the end that was outside the formal language of the rest. The complaint appears consistent with the pattern of interference documented across the disputed cases. It has been added to the file. Clara read this at the kitchen table and let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 30 hours. Birch added the complaint to the evidence file, she told Daniel when he came in. Daniel stopped in the doorway. What? He interpreted Whitmore's attempt to discredit me as evidence of consciousness of guilt, Clara said. Which it is. A man who is innocent of fraud does not immediately attempt to destroy the credibility of the woman who found his fraudulent notarization stamp. The fact that Whitmore filed the complaint actually strengthens our case. She set down the telegraph message. He overreached. Daniel looked at the paper in her hand and then at her. You knew he might do that, Daniel said. It wasn't quite a question. I thought there was a chance, she said. Aggressive men in a losing position often do. They can't stop themselves. They see a target and they move on it before they think it through. She paused. I didn't know Birch would respond that way. That was Birch. That was good fortune and good judgment on his part. And 2 weeks of him watching you work, Daniel said. He met you once. He wrote a letter of recommendation the same day. Men don't do that for people they're not certain about. Clara looked at the telegraph message. My father never once, she said. And then she stopped because that sentence had more weight in it than she intended to release right now. Daniel heard it anyway. He came fully into the kitchen and sat down across the table from her in the chair that had become his chair at this table, the way things become yours through the accumulation of choosing them. Tell me, he said. My father never once told me I did anything well, Clara said. Not the boundary dispute. Not the 11 years of keeping that farm running. Not a single morning when I came in from the fields or the records office or the creditors' offices with something accomplished. She kept her voice even. He told Ruth she was pretty. He told me I was capable, which is the word men use when they mean useful and don't want to say anything more than that. A pause. I understood what I was worth by the weight of the silence around what I did, by the fact that when something broke they called for me, not for my sister, for me. Daniel was very still across the table. Birch wrote that letter after one meeting, Clara said, because he saw what I did and said so. That's... She stopped. That matters to me more than it probably should for a woman of 26, who should be past needing that kind of recognition. It's not about being past it, Daniel said. It's about what you deserved all along and didn't get. He held her gaze. You're not still looking for your father to say it, you're just surprised, Clara said. When people say it. Then I'll say it, he said. Plainly so, there's no ambiguity. You are the most capable person I've known in a long time, the most clear-eyed, the most honest. He leaned forward slightly. And I was an absolute fool on that platform. Clara looked at him across the kitchen table, with Birch's telegraph between them and the morning light in the room. And she did not cry, because she was not a woman who cried when there was nothing useful crying could do. But she felt something in her chest unlock that had been locked for a long time, and she let it unlock because there was a place for that here, and she was learning to use it. You were frightened, she said. You'd been alone and narrowed for 2 years, and you were expecting a solution to arrive, and what arrived was a woman who didn't fit the shape of the solution you'd imagined. People do worse when they're frightened. You're being generous, he said. I'm being accurate, she said. There's a difference. The certified documentation from Wichita arrived 4 days later, and it was everything Clara needed. The full record of the Finch versus Harlow filing her formal submissions. The county clerk's notations confirming the quality and accuracy of her work, and a letter from the Wichita County Record Supervisor unprompted, attesting that Miss Finch had spent 4 months in their office and had demonstrated a professional understanding of deed chain analysis that the supervisor had rarely encountered in untrained individuals. She packaged this with her written response to Caldwell, which was 12 pages long, documented, and left no element of the complaint unaddressed. She had written it over 3 evenings at the study desk, with Daniel sometimes present working on his own correspondence, and sometimes out with Cal. And she had written it with the particular controlled fury of a woman who has been called fraudulent for knowing something. She sent it to Caldwell. She sent a copy to Birch. She sent a copy to the Land Commissioner's office directly with a cover letter, noting that it was submitted in anticipation of the complaint which had already been forwarded there. Then she went and helped Cal set the south fence posts because they needed setting, and she had said she would help on Thursday, and she was not going to let Rance Whitmore alter the rhythm of the work that kept this ranch running. Cal was quiet company, which she had come to appreciate. He worked methodically and without wasted motion, and he accepted her help without the particular performance of surprise that men sometimes produced when a woman turned out to be competent at physical work. They set 4 posts in 3 hours, working in easy coordination, and at the end of it, Cal said, "You're good at this," without any particular ceremony. "Thank you," Clara said. "Daniel's better at this ranch than he lets on too," Cal said, tamping soil around the base of the last post. "He got narrow this year. You probably know that." "He told me. He doesn't tell people things," Cal said. He looked at the fence line rather than at her. "He told Margaret things before he got narrow. He stopped that too." A pause. "He's been different since you came. Not I don't mean that in a way that's any of my business. I mean he's managing the whole operation again, looking at all of it, the way he used to. Clara picked up her tools. He was managing it before I came, she said. He just needed someone to help carry the part that was crushing everything else. Cal picked up his tools. They walked back toward the barn in the comfortable quiet of people who have done a thing together and don't need to narrate it. I'm glad he didn't send you back, Cal said, as they reached the gate. So am I, Clara said. Whitmore made his last direct approach on a Friday afternoon, and this time he came alone. No men on the wagon bench, no lawyer. Just Whitmore on horseback riding up the lane at a measured pace that said he had made a decision and had arrived at the calm that comes after a decision is made. Clara was on the porch when he came through the gate. She had been reading over Birch's most recent communication, and she stood up and waited. He swung down from his horse and tied it at the post and came to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the pleasant threat of his first visit. Not the cold assessment of a man calculating angles. Something else. Something that looked, if she were going to name it honestly, like a man who has run the numbers a final time and found them unworkable. Is Holt here? He said. He's in the field, Clara said. I can get him. That's all right, Whitmore said. I can say to you what I came to say. He looked at her for a moment. The complaint against you, I'm withdrawing it. Clara kept her face still. Why? She said. Because it was a bad decision, he said. And because Birch informed my attorney this morning that the complaint had been added to the federal file as evidence of interference. A pause. I didn't expect that. Most people don't expect to be held accountable for the things they do in the middle of a fraud, Clara said. They assume the fraud insulates them. Whitmore looked at her steadily. He was a man who had operated for a long time in a world where the things he wanted generally fell into alignment through a combination of money and pressure, and the woman standing on this porch was a thing that had not fallen into alignment and showed no indication of starting. You're not what I expected, he said. And it was the same thing he had said on the first visit almost verbatim, except this time, it did not sound like contempt. It sounded, if anything, like honesty. The involuntary honesty of a man speaking to someone he has been thoroughly beaten by. You said that before, Clara said. I mean it differently now, he said. He untied his horse. He mounted. He looked down at her from the saddle with the expression of a man closing a ledger on a loss. The deed claim is being withdrawn, he said. My attorney is filing the withdrawal with the federal office Monday morning. Clara stared at him. The 40 acres, she said. Holt keeps it. The water rights the tributary access the full boundary. He settled in the saddle. The investigation would have found what you found eventually, and it would have found more. He looked at the reins in his hands. I have other properties. This one isn't worth what the federal investigation costs me. He turned the horse toward the gate. Mr. Whitmore, Clara said. He stopped but didn't turn. The other cases, she said. The ranchers in Hayes County. The others. A pause. That's not my business anymore. Birch's investigation doesn't stop at this case, Clara said. It covers the pattern. The other cases are already in the federal file. Another pause longer. I know, Whitmore said. He rode out through the gate and down the lane and did not look back. Clara stood on the porch and watched until the sound of hooves faded, and then she sat down on the step, the repaired step solid under her weight, and let herself feel the full dimension of what had just happened. He was gone. The claim was gone. The 40 acres, the water rights, the southern tributary. All of it back where it belonged. She heard Daniel before she saw him. His boots on the lane, coming at a pace that meant someone had come out to the field to tell him. He came through the gate and looked at her and stopped. Cal said Whitmore was here, he said. He's withdrawing the claim, Clara said. Monday morning, federal office, the full 40 acres. Daniel stood in the lane and looked at her, and his face did the thing it had been doing more often in recent weeks, the thing where all the careful management came undone, and what was underneath it was simply there, visible, the face of a man who felt something and was not in this moment doing anything to hide it. He came up the porch steps and sat down beside her, and they sat together on the solid repaired boards in the late afternoon, with the 40 acres still there, still his, as it had always been his. "You did this," he said. "We did this," Clara said. "Birch did this. Cal did this. The Hayes County rancher who didn't settle did this. Whitmore's own arrogance did a considerable amount of this." Clara. Daniel. He turned to look at her directly, close enough that there was nothing managed or careful between them, just his face and hers, and the specific truth of where they had arrived. "When I came to this ranch," he said, "I had a house and land and a problem that was eating both of them. Now I have the house and the land, and the problem is gone." He paused. "But what I have, what actually matters, is that you're in it." Clara looked at him. "I know what I want," he said. "I'm not narrow about it, and I'm not frightened about it anymore. I want you here, not on a contract, not as an arrangement." He held her gaze. "I want you here because you are the most honest and capable and clear-eyed person who has ever sat at my kitchen table, and because you fixed my porch boards at 6 in the morning without being asked, and because you walked into a federal land office in a strange city and changed the shape of everything, and because when Whitmore stood on this porch and tried to dismiss you, you didn't move an inch." A pause. "I want you here because I am better with you here, and because I think that this might be the place you were moving toward." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "It is," she said. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with ceremony, the way he did most things that mattered, plainly, directly, with complete intention. She let him. She turned her hand and held his. They sat together on the porch of the Holt Ranch in the late Friday afternoon, with the 40 acres intact around them, and the problem finished, and the next season of work still ahead, and the particular silence that belongs to two people who have stopped negotiating the terms of something and have simply arrived. "The vendor contracts," Clara said after a while. "Monday," Daniel said. "The barn roof has a section that won't make it through winter." "I know," Cal flagged it. "The flour bin?" "Clara," he said. And there was something warm in how he said it, something that was new, and was also the most natural thing she had heard in a long time. "One thing at a time." She looked at their hands. His large and calloused, hers smaller and equally calloused, both of them, the hands of people who had worked hard for a long time. "All right," she said. Outside the gate, Dusty Creek was going about its Friday afternoon, and the Texas sky was doing what Texas skies do in autumn, enormous, indifferent, magnificent. The south pasture lay quiet and intact. The fence posts Cal and Clara had set on Thursday were solid in the ground. The porch boards under them held steady. Clara Finch, who had arrived on a train 3 weeks ago as somebody's mistake, sat on this porch as something else entirely. Not the contract, not the arrangement, not the woman nobody had sent for. The woman who stayed. The woman who saw everything and said so. The woman who had found what she was moving toward and had the nerve to remain. The withdrawal landed in the Federal Record on Monday morning, exactly as Whitmore had said it would. Birch sent a telegraph by noon confirming receipt. The claim was formally vacated. The 40 acres, the southern tributary, the water rights, all of it restored to the Holt Ranch deed without condition or encumbrance, as if the 6-month dispute had been erased from the legal record, while leaving every scar it had made on the people who had lived through it fully intact. That was how legal resolutions worked. The paper healed clean. The people took longer. Daniel read Birch's message, standing at the kitchen table, and then he set it down and stood with his hands flat on the wood for a moment, very still, the way he went still when something hit him at a depth he wasn't going to perform for anyone. Clara was at the stove. She heard the paper set down. She heard the quality of the silence. She let him have it. After a moment he said, "It's done." "Yes," she said. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He looked out the window at the south pasture, which was his in the complete and uncontested way it had been his father's before him, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who is seeing something he almost lost and is allowing himself to understand what that means. "I want to ride the boundary," he said. "The full southern line, today." "Go," Clara said. "I'll have dinner ready when you come back." He looked at her. "Come with me." She turned from the stove. He was not asking in the way of a man who needs company on a difficult errand. He was asking in the way of a man who wants to share something with a specific person, because the sharing is part of what makes the thing real. She untied her apron. They rode the southern boundary together, all 40 acres of it, following the fence line Cal's crew had maintained through the whole dispute without ever being told to stop, because Cal was the kind of man who maintained things on principle. The tributary ran alongside the eastern edge low with the dry season, but present in the way water in Texas is always present, not as abundance, but as a fact of survival, the difference between a viable operation and one that is slowly dying. Daniel didn't say much as they rode. He didn't need to. Clara rode beside him and let him look at his land, and understood that this was not a silence that needed filling. At the southern corner, he stopped the horse and looked east along the fence line and said, "My father built this fence the year before he died. I was 16. He put me on the post-setting crew, and I worked beside the hands, and he never said a word about whether I was doing it right or wrong." A pause. "When we finished the last section, he shook my hand, like I was one of the men. I didn't understand at the time what that meant." He looked at the fence. "I understand now." Clara looked at the fence too. "He knew you'd have to hold it," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "I think he did." They rode back in the long afternoon light, and by the time the ranch buildings came into view, Clara had made a decision she had been working toward for several days, and she had made it cleanly without drama, the way she made most decisions, by letting the facts accumulate until the conclusion became unavoidable. She was staying. Not because of the contract, not because of the case, because this was where she had arrived, and it was where she chose to be, and she was not a woman who confused choosing with settling. Margaret came to find her that evening. Not in the aggressive proprietary way of the first weeks when every interaction had the quality of territory being defended. She came quietly to the study where Clara was organizing the final documentation for Birch's file, and she stood in the doorway in the particular way of a person who has rehearsed something and is deciding whether to say it. Clara looked up. "Sit down, Margaret." She sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the study held the settled quiet of a room that had been the site of a great deal of consequential work and knew it. "I want to ask you something," Margaret said. "Directly." "Please," Clara said. "Do you love my brother?" She said it without flinching, which Clara respected. "Not do you care for this ranch or find him decent or think this is a workable arrangement. Do you love him?" Clara set down her pen. She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am in the process of loving him. I think it started somewhere around the eastern fence line when he told me about the 40 acres and the water rights, and I watched him understand that someone had used his trust against him, and he didn't collapse, and he didn't rage. He just looked at me and asked what to do next." She paused. "I have spent my whole life around people who either collapsed under hard things or raged against them without thinking. He did neither. That matters to me." Margaret was quiet. "And I think," Clara continued, "that I will love him more next year than I do today, and more the year after that, because he is a man who reveals himself slowly and honestly, and what he reveals is worth the patience it takes to wait for it." She looked at Margaret. "That is the most truthful answer I can give you." Margaret looked at the desk between them, at the organized papers, at the notebook that had traveled to San Marcos and back and had its pages read by a federal examiner. "He hasn't been happy," Margaret said, "in a long time. He's been functional, responsible, managing, but not happy." She looked up. "Since you came, he eats dinner like a person who is present at it. He talks. Last Thursday he laughed at something Cal said, and it was the first time I've heard him laugh since his father died." She pressed her lips together. I was wrong about you. I said that before. I want to say it more completely this time. You were protective of him, Clara said. That's not wrong. I was protective of him, and I aimed it at you, which was. Margaret straightened in the chair. I know what it cost you the first days. And I know you didn't let it stop you, which is either courage or stubbornness. In my experience, they're the same thing, Clara said. Margaret almost smiled. The same almost smile as before, the one that lived at the edge of her composure and came out when something caught her off guard in a direction she hadn't defended against. He's going to ask you properly, Margaret said. I don't know when, but he's been talking to the minister. A pause. I'm not supposed to tell you that. Then I won't know it until he does, Clara said. Officially, Margaret stood. She looked at Clara for a moment, a long assessing look that was not hostile and not entirely warm, but was honest, which Clara valued above warmth. Take care of him, she said. I intend to take care of this ranch, Clara said. And everyone on it, including you if you'll allow it. Margaret looked at her for another moment. I might, she said, and left. The letter from Ruth arrived the following week in response to Clara's own letter, describing carefully without overselling the situation in Dusty Creek and the shape of what her life had become here. Ruth wrote back in her generous, looping handwriting 3 pages of it, and the first paragraph contained a sentence that Clara read 3 times. Mother would have liked him, I think. She would have liked that you found someone who sees you. She always said the problem wasn't that you were too capable. She said the problem was that capable women were surrounded by people who confused your capability with not needing anything. I think she was right. Clara folded that letter carefully. She put it in the top drawer of the nightstand in the room that had been the guest room, and was now her room, the room where she kept her trunk and her notebook and the other things she had brought from Wichita. She put it there because it was the kind of thing that needed to be close but not looked at every day, something to know was present. She had not cried about her father yet. She was saving that for a time when the work allowed it. She had a sense that the time was coming, and she was not afraid of it. She had learned that grief had its own schedule, and that the most efficient thing to do with it was let it run on that schedule rather than fighting the timing. What she did instead that afternoon was go over the vendor contracts with Daniel at the kitchen table and correct 3 errors that had accumulated during the months he had been managing everything alone, and negotiate with him on behalf of common sense a better rate from the grain supplier who had been taking advantage of the operational disorder. She wrote the letter to the grain supplier herself. Daniel signed it. She folded it and addressed it, and it went with the Tuesday mail. He watched her do all of this with an expression she had come to know well. The expression of a man who is watching something he values and allowing himself to know it. You're reorganizing my supply contracts, he said. I'm correcting 3 years of gradual drift, she said. Someone has to. I'm not complaining, he said. The formal federal finding arrived on a Wednesday 47 days into the investigation ahead of Birch's 60-day preliminary estimate, which told Clara that what they had documented had been significant enough to accelerate the process. It was addressed to Daniel, but there was a cover letter addressed to Clara separately, which Birch had apparently decided was warranted. She opened hers first, standing at the kitchen table, while Daniel opened his, and she read it while he read his, and neither of them said anything for a moment after. Birch's letter to Clara was 4 paragraphs. The first summarized the findings of the investigation. The Whitmore deed chain had been formally determined to be fraudulent across 3 of the 4 disputed cases, and federal fraud charges were being referred to the territorial prosecutor's office. The second paragraph addressed the pattern documentation Clara had compiled, and stated that it had been the primary instrument of the expanded investigation. The third paragraph noted that the other ranchers affected by Whitmore's scheme had been notified and were being assisted in reviewing their own cases. The fourth paragraph said Miss Finch, in 23 years of land record examination, I have encountered a handful of individuals whose capacity for this work was immediately evident, and whose contribution to a case was decisive. You are among them. I meant what I wrote in my earlier communication. The offer of a letter of recommendation stands without expiration. Whatever you choose to do with it is entirely your own business, but you should know that you have it. Clara set the letter on the table. Daniel had read his. He set it beside hers. Whitmore is being prosecuted, he said. Yes? The other ranchers are getting their cases reviewed. Yes. He looked at her. You did that. Birch did that, she said. The law did that. The pattern was there before I found it. Clara. He said her name the way he said it when he wanted her to stop managing her own contribution down to something more comfortable. She had noticed he did that, caught her diminishing herself, and refused to let it stand. She was learning to let him refuse. You did that. She looked at the two letters side by side on the kitchen table. Yes, she said. I did. He asked her on a Sunday, not in a planned ceremonial way. There was no particular staging to it, no moment constructed to be memorable. Which was exactly right, Clara thought later, because Daniel Holt was not a man who staged things. He was a man who did necessary things directly when the moment was present, without waiting for it to be more than it was. They were walking back from the south pasture where they had gone in the evening to check on the cattle after a young hand had reported one of the cows showing signs of difficulty. The cow was fine. It had been a false alarm, the kind that happens on a working ranch several times a season, and they were walking back in the cooling evening with the particular relaxed quality of people who had braced for something and found it unnecessary. Daniel stopped walking about 50 yards from the house. Clara stopped too because he had. He turned to face her. He had his hat in his hands, which he did when he was saying something that mattered, and he looked at her with the direct, unmanaged expression she had come to understand was his most honest face, the one that appeared when he had stopped deciding what to show and was simply showing. I talked to Reverend Miles, he said. I know, Clara said. And then, because she had promised Margaret she would pretend not to know, I assumed you might. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Margaret told you. Margaret suggested it was possible you might be making certain inquiries. I'm going to have a conversation with Margaret about discretion, he said. She loves you, Clara said. She was trying to prepare me. Did you need preparing? Clara looked at him. No, she said. I've known for a while what I wanted. I was waiting for you to catch up. He almost laughed. It was the same laugh Cal had described, the one that had been missing for 2 years and had come back since she arrived. She felt it like something physical, that laugh. Clara Finch, he said. And then he said it plainly and directly, and without ceremony, the way he did everything that mattered. Will you marry me? Not on a contract, not as an arrangement. As my wife, because I choose you, and I want you to choose me, and because I want to spend the rest of my life sitting across from you at the kitchen table, watching you correct my vendor contracts and argue with my grain supplier. Clara looked at him in the cooling evening, with the south pasture behind him and the house ahead, and 40 acres of secured land around them in every direction. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He put his hat back on. He took her hand. They walked back to the house. The wedding was in October, 6 weeks later, small by the standards of what Dusty Creek considered a proper ranching family's wedding, and larger than either Clara or Daniel had asked for, because Margaret had opinions about the guest list that turned out to be impossible to argue against on practical grounds, and Clara had decided early that some battles were worth engaging, and some were worth letting Margaret win. Reverend Miles performed the ceremony in the church, which was full because the town had decided to attend in the way that small towns decide things collectively, without formal announcement, through the shared understanding that this was a thing worth witnessing. Clara wore a dress that Margaret had helped her make, which was the most significant shift in their relationship, and the one Clara valued most because it had not been forced or performed. Margaret had simply appeared one afternoon with fabric and a practical expression and said, "You'll need something suitable," and had sat across from Clara at the kitchen table for 3 evenings, cutting and pinning, and occasionally saying things that had nothing to do with the dress, and everything to do with two women learning the shape of each other. Purvis from the record office came. Cal stood beside Daniel. The woman from the dry goods store sat in the third pew and cried, which Clara would not have predicted, and which moved her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Birch sent a letter. He could not attend, being 3 hours away and busy with the ongoing prosecution. But the letter arrived the morning of the wedding, and Daniel read it aloud at the breakfast table, and it said, among other things, that he hoped they would be very happy, and that the Federal Land Office of San Marcos was a better institution for having had Clara Finch walk through its door. Clara's father did not come. He was not well enough to travel, Ruth wrote, and Clara understood and did not press it. She had made her peace with her father in the way that people make peace with things that will never be what they wished, not by pretending it was fine, but by accepting the shape of what it actually was and building her life around it rather than against it. Ruth came. That was the thing Clara had not allowed herself to expect, because expecting it would have made it too fragile. But Ruth arrived on the Friday train with her good dress in a bag, and her generous smile, and her looping handwriting, made present in a physical person, and Clara met her at the platform, the same platform where 3 months ago she had stood with her trunk and heard Daniel say she was not the one he had sent for. And Ruth looked at her sister's face and said, "You look different." "Do I?" Clara said. "You look like someone who is exactly where she's supposed to be," Ruth said. Clara held her sister's arm as they walked up the platform, and she thought about the train she had taken from Kansas, and the 3 days of sitting upright through the dry country, and the feeling she'd had looking out the window at a Texas she didn't know yet, that she was moving toward something that wasn't already decided. She had been right. At the altar, Daniel took her hands and looked at her, and said his vows in the plain, direct way of everything he said that mattered clearly, without excess meaning every word. She said hers the same way. Reverend Miles pronounced them married, and the church made a sound that small churches make when everyone in them has been holding their breath and finally lets go. What the town talked about after was not the wedding itself, because weddings in Dusty Creek followed a recognizable pattern that made them easy to narrate. What they talked about was the reception which was held on the Holt Ranch, because the house was large enough, and Margaret had organized it with a thoroughness that suggested she had been waiting for an occasion to demonstrate her capacity for organization, and was making the most of it. Specifically, what they talked about was the moment when old Harker, who ran 300 acres adjacent to the Holt Ranch's western boundary, and had watched the Whitmore dispute from close range, with the sympathetic attention of a man who understood exactly how such things developed, stood up with a glass and said what everyone was thinking. He said, "I have watched this ranch for 23 years. I watched Daniel's father build it, and I watched Daniel hold it. I've seen hard seasons and bad winters, and the kind of trouble that comes from men who think the law is a tool for whoever can afford to swing it." He looked at Clara, who was standing beside Daniel with her hand in his. "And I have watched this woman walk into that trouble with nothing but a notebook and a clear head, and take it apart from the inside." He raised his glass. "To Clara Holt, who came here as nobody's first choice and turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to this ranch." The room drank. Clara felt Daniel's hand tighten around hers, and she did not look at him immediately, because she knew if she looked at him, she would feel too much at once, and she was in a room full of people, and she was going to manage herself until she was not. She looked at Ruth instead, who was sitting at the table across the room with her good dress and her generous smile, and Ruth raised her glass specifically to Clara, and Clara raised hers back. Later, when the guests had gone, and the house was quiet, and Margaret had retreated with the efficient satisfaction of a woman whose event had succeeded on every measurable dimension, Clara and Daniel sat on the porch together. The repaired porch, the solid porch, the one that would not fail before winter. The stars were out in the way they came out in Texas, when there were no clouds, completely decisively, as if they had things to say, and the sky was large enough to say all of them at once. "Harker called you Clara Holt," Daniel said. "I heard," she said. "How did it sound?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. It sounded like something that fits, she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it, and they sat on the solid porch of the ranch that was theirs in the complete and uncontested way that the right things belong to the right people when enough work has been done to hold them. The barn roof, Clara said. I know, Daniel said, before the first freeze. Cal has the lumber ordered, he said. Thursday. And the Abilene buyer needs a response by Friday on the spring contract. I'll write it tomorrow. The terms he offered are below market, she said. I looked at the regional figures. We can get better. He turned to look at her. On our wedding night, he said, you are renegotiating my cattle contracts. I'm noting that they can be improved, she said. The renegotiation is for Monday. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she loved most on his face, the one that was trying not to smile and was losing, and then he stopped trying. He laughed. Full and unguarded, the laugh that had been missing for 2 years, the one that had found its way back. She felt it the same way she always felt it, like something coming right that had been wrong for too long. All right, he said. Monday. She leaned back against his arm and looked at the Texas stars, enormous and indifferent and magnificent. The same stars that had been overhead the night she'd arrived on this land with her trunk and her notebook, and no certainty about anything except that she was done standing still and waiting to be chosen. She thought about the platform, about the words she had heard on it, and the way they had landed, and the way she had stood inside them without moving, because moving would have meant something she refused to mean. She thought about the county record office and Birch's reading room, and the train to San Marcos, and the federal examiner's desk, and the moment she had looked at a fraudulent notarization stamp and understood exactly what it meant and what to do about it. She thought about Ruth's letter. Capable women were surrounded by people who confused your capability with not needing anything. She had needed things. She had always needed things. She had simply stopped waiting for the wrong people to provide them and had gone looking for the right place to need them instead. She had found it, not by accident, not by being chosen, by moving deliberately in the direction of a life that had room for everything she actually was. The competence and the need and the grief and the capacity and the particular determination of a woman who had kept a failing farm alive for 11 years through sheer precision and will, and had decided one morning that she deserved something that wasn't failing. She had come here as nobody's first choice. She had become, by the work of her own hands and the honesty of her own mind, exactly what this ranch and this man and this life had needed most. And she was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply finally come home to a place that knew how to see her and had stayed.